Welcome to the Iran 1400 Project podcast, where we explore the past, present, and possible futures of Iran through informed dialogue, independent thought, and diverse voices. From historical insight to emerging narratives, we connect ideas to action in the pursuit of a more just, inclusive, and forward-looking society. Join us as we rethink Iran's trajectory, one conversation at a time.
Today we are really getting into the weeds on the political and, I guess, moral architecture of justice in Iran, specifically over the last century or so. Our focus is to synthesize the insights from two really critical pieces from the Iran 1400 Project's Civic Reawakening Initiative.
And these sources are so important because they don't just give you a historical timeline. They really trace how this pursuit of Adālah, of justice, became tangled up with institutional power.
Right, and how that power in turn systematically manufactured exclusion.
Exactly.
So we're looking at two forces that you can't really separate. This enduring public struggle for an equitable state, and then this deliberate process of othering that defines who gets to belong and who doesn't.
And the central ethical question that kind of guides us through all of this is, if the very foundations of truth and trust have been captured repeatedly by the ruling power, how can a society even begin to restore that moral covenant? It's really the ultimate challenge of modern Iranian civic life.
Okay, let's unpack this evolution. We can start with the Pahlavi era and this idea of justice as a sort of unfinished moral project. The first article introduces Adālah as something more than just law. It's the ethical architecture of belonging.
And what we see in the Pahlavi dynasty from 1925 to 1979 is this deep, deep paradox.
Modernization without legitimacy.
That's it, exactly. Reza Shah, he brings in these massive judicial reforms, modeling them very closely on European civil codes. The explicit aim was to secularize the courts.
To break that centuries-old clerical control over justice.
Precisely.
So on paper, this looks like progress, right?
Yeah.
You're building a modern, rational state system. But the source argues this system gave them order, but it failed to create trust. Why?
Because the whole exercise was top-down. The courts delivered what you could call a bureaucratized virtue. Everything was legible, it was codified.
Right.
But rights weren't seen as inherent. They were treated as administrative categories granted by the monarch.
And if rights can be granted by a ruler,
they can be revoked by that same ruler. The citizen never really gets to participate in defining what that justice is.
And that gap, that separation between the state's order and the citizen's trust, that's what ultimately leads to the instability before 79.
Exactly. Political participation was it was dramatically curtailed, especially with repression under Civic. The justice system became an arm of state control. It ensured stability, sure, but it denied liberty.
This lack of trust really sets the stage for the dramatic and ultimately disastrous shift after the 1979 revolution. The new system didn't just change the government, it re-sacralized the entire concept of justice, aligning it with the Shia theological idea of the justice of God.
And the foundational shift here is the introduction of Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist.
Under Ayatollah Khomeini.
Right. And this structure, it just dissolves the separation between moral and political power. The practical outcome of this is fascinating. The rule of law basically yields to the rule of opinion.
The rule of opinion. Can you tell us more about what that practically meant for an average person in a courtroom?
It means legal predictability just vanishes. Judges were allowed to rule based on authentic Islamic sources and fatwas whenever codified law was, absent or unclear.
So the whole space becomes subjective. Politicized.
Deeply. It let the state criminalize dissent without needing clear, transparent laws. It was complete rejection of any kind of neutral, universal legal framework.
And this is where we see the immediate and violent consequences of that shift. The sources cite a pretty devastating fact here.
The figures are they're stark. Between 1981 and 1985 alone,
just a 4-year period.
A 4-year period, more than 7,900 people were executed.
Wow.
That number is nearly 100 times the total executions during the entire last decade of the Shah's rule. It just shows how quickly justice went from being a bureaucratic tool of control to a sharp theological weapon.
Which sets this grim context for our next segment. The institutionalization of injustice under the Islamic Republic. Once the legal system was politicized, the machinery was perfected.
The structure itself is very telling. The head of the judiciary is appointed directly by the supreme leader. So there goes any idea of judicial independence.
Due process becomes a formality.
Just a ritual. And perhaps the most chilling legal tool they developed was the use of these vaguely defined sort of elastic crimes.
You're talking about things like muharebe, waging war against God. That phrase sounds so medieval. What's its practical use in a modern state?
What's crucial to understand is its sheer breadth. Muharebe is rarely reserved just for armed rebels. It's been used against journalists, political dissidents, protesters.
So any significant nonviolent dissent?
It can be labeled as treason against the state's divine mandate. And that creates this terrifying, chilling effect, because if you protest, you're not just breaking the law, you are, in their view, waging war against God. And that justifies execution.
And beyond these political crimes, you see the persistence of Qisas retribution, where a victim's families can demand an execution. Why would a modern state keep this system of, personalized vengeance?
That's a fascinating and a terrible piece of political logic. Qisas basically privatizes justice.
How so?
It allows the state to redirect all that rage and demand for accountability away from itself and toward an individual offender and the victim's family. The system stays because it's a mechanism of social control. It outsources the executioner's role.
And perpetuates vengeance instead of reconciliation.
Right. And this whole institutional framework, of course, explicitly embeds discrimination against minorities.
Absolutely. The system formalized it. Even when they made changes, like in 2004 with reforms to equalize diya, or blood money, for non-Muslim men.
The Baha'is remained explicitly excluded. They were carved out, denied equal compensation under the law.
And this is where the first article brings up what it calls the most insidious form of injustice, the sustained assault on truth. This goes way beyond the courtroom.
This is the subtlest, but maybe the most enduring form of damage. When a state engages in decades of censorship, propaganda, historical revisionism, it's mobilizing moral memory. It dismantles the shared emotional architecture of belonging.
And if people can't agree on a shared truth,
they can't govern themselves justly. It's impossible.
This leads to what the scholars call learned falseness. If you suppress authentic expression long enough, people internalize duplicity just to survive.
That's the corrosion. When honesty is punished and duplicity is rewarded, trust just erodes at the molecular level of society. People stop trusting their neighbors, their institutions, eventually themselves.
It's a profound violation.
It's the destruction of the civic soul.
It makes sense then why the sources put such a profound emphasis on Iranian art and literature, poetry, cinema as moral archives.
They had to. Those archives became the repository of the nation's ethical imagination. They were quietly resisting the official, falsified history that was being imposed by the state.
That idea of a moral archives is a perfect bridge to our second article, which is all about the mechanics of exclusion, the anatomy of othering. If the first source showed us the failure of the system, this second one really reveals who the system was designed to fail.
And othering, at its core, is the process of defining the dominant identity by actively denying full membership and therefore justice to certain groups.
So let's trace this. The articles argue the precedent for this kind of state paranoia was set way back with the Bobby movement in the mid-19th century.
Absolutely. The Bobby movement was the first major case where a purely theological challenge, an internal Muslim heresy, was successfully translated by the Qajar state into a national security crisis, into sedition.
That's a critical link. It created the template for repression. Clerical rulings justifying state coercion.
Defining loyalty by exclusion. And that template was just seamlessly inherited and then amplified by the Islamic Republic. The Baha'i faith, which grew out of the Bobby movement, became the primary target.
And the regime was able to fuse that old theological stigma with a modern political vocabulary, right? specifically linking the Baha'i faith to Zionism.
Correct. The fact that the Baha'i World Center is in Haifa, Israel, was just completely weaponized to label the entire community as dependents of Zionism. It's the old Qadar prototype, but with a new, potent, external enemy hook.
And the institutional exclusion that follows is just devastating. The Baha'is are the largest unrecognized minority, barred from universities, public sector jobs.
The impact is profound, but at the same time, it sparked these incredible acts of resistance.
You mean like the BIE?
Exactly. Being barred from public universities led to the creation of the underground Baha'i Institute for Higher Education. The shadow university, run by volunteer professors in makeshift classrooms, it's just a magnificent example of intellectual resistance against erasure.
It's an incredible act of civic resilience.
Yeah.
And the irony of their denied citizenship is just heartbreaking, especially when you look at the Iran-Iraq War.
That anecdote is so vital. You have Baha'i conscripts like Farhang Shah Bahrami, who died fighting for Iran.
They sacrificed their lives for the nation.
But they were denied martyr status, stripped of the full rights and recognition that other war dead received. It shows that their citizenship in practice meant nothing when the state insisted on exclusion in law.
So this raises the big question.
Yeah.
Why does the system need this internal enemy? The scholars and the sources have a powerful analysis here.
Well, Abbas Amanat argues it's driven by the necessity of the internal enemy. Historically, after Iran was humiliated by 19th century imperial powers, that national rage was redirected inward. Creating an internal enemy became a mechanism of social control.
An outlet for resentment. And Azadeh Porzan takes this even further. Arguing othering isn't just prejudice, it's manufactured by power structures.
A calculated multi-stage process. You convert difference into threat, which leads to dehumanization, which then justifies violence.
So if we connect those ideas, we see this recurring cycle of fear and exclusion shadowing Iran's entire modern history.
Yes, from the Pahlavi's centralized courts right through to the Islamic Republic's security apparatus.
And yet, despite all this, the sources offer this profound counter-narrative, this civic reawakening. The civic imagination just refused to die.
That's where the hope lies. After 1989, you see the emergence of a new civil society, NGOs, legal activists who tested the system's boundaries. You have names like Shirin Ebadi, Marangis Kar.
And they transformed justice from an abstract concept back into a lived civic practice. They founded organizations like the Defenders of Human Rights Center,
making accountability real. And when the space for action at home narrowed, the transnational work of diaspora groups like the Center for Human Rights in Iran ensured the struggle became a living international conscience.
This grassroots energy then lays the groundwork for what the sources call the gender turn.
The 2006 1 Million Signatures campaign, for instance, it consciously used Quranic principles of equity quest to try and bridge the faith and feminist communities. It was brilliant.
Demanding universal rights, but using a locally resonant language, which culminates dramatically in the 2022 Woman, Life, Freedom movement.
Right. And the sources frame this as the vernacular of a new Iranian enlightenment. It's a collective demand for universal dignity that moves beyond the failed ideologies of the past century.
It's the ultimate rejection of that learned falseness we talked about.
It is. The movement is essentially insisting that living truthfully and demanding inherent human dignity. That's the prerequisite for any functioning civic order.
And this brings us right to the synthesis of both articles. The path forward is about redefining justice as ethical infrastructure. It means rebuilding three capacities that were destroyed.
Those capacities are truth-telling, so confronting a falsified history, trust building, creating spaces where honesty is actually rewarded, not punished, and transcendence.
Transcendence being the moral imagination to envision dignity and belonging for all citizens, even those who were historically othered.
The ultimate conclusion here is that the future can't rely on justice being decreed from on high, whether by a secular monarch or a theological jurist.
It has to be redefined.
It has to be redefined as a shared responsibility, a moral covenant among citizens themselves. A century of this struggle has shown that justice cannot be imposed. It has to be imagined, built, and defended together.
So if we look back at the failures one last time, you could say the Pahlavis offered law without liberty.
And the Islamic Republic offered virtue without fairness.
And the civic reawakening is demanding truth with trust.
That synthesis, truth as the foundation, trust as the currency, that is the only way forward.
So we'll leave you, our listener, with this thought, which builds on everything we've just discussed. If justice is truly the social expression of truth, And if decades of this learned falseness have corroded the foundations of society, what small, immediate act of truth-telling can you practice today to restore just a fragment of trust in your own life or in your community? Because, as this emerging Iranian citizenry insists, justice is the rightful inheritance of every human heart that dares to tell the truth.
Thank you for listening to the Iran 1400 Project podcast. The Iran 1400 Project invites scholars, experts, and intellectuals to share their assessment of the evolution of institutions and ideas during the past 100 years to inspire a vision of Iran in the 1400s. If you found today's episode thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe, share, and continue the conversation. For more content and upcoming events, visit Iran1400.org. Until next time, stay engaged, stay informed, and stay hopeful.